The sun is out. The questions are in. We've got another Q&A special on the What's on Stage podcast. How are you doing, Sarah? Has it been a lovely week?
I've had a lovely week. I have once again postponed cutting my lawn. So my back garden, which is a very small suburban back garden, looks like a country meadow. So I'm sitting here watching my grass thinking, oh my goodness, I should be cutting it. Apart from that, I'm in very, very fine form.
Nice. I am also staring at my grass and it's growing in front of my eyes. Clearly, we're just not horticultural people, are we? We're cultural people, not horticultural people.
Oh,
no, you are quite a horticultural person.
Yeah, I am quite horticultural, but not with grass, I think is the truth. And also, it's good for bees. So that's what I'm going to say.
True.
I've got a lot of celandine, a lot of dandelions. It's very nice for the insects.
It's altruism. Yeah, that's it. Yeah. It's not negligence. Yes. And you went to see a very stellar production of Ibsen, I believe, over in Hammersmith.
Yes, really interesting production of Ibsen, written by Gary Owen, directed by Rachel O'Riordan, who had brought us Iphigenia in Splot, which was brilliant monologue, which transposed the whole idea of Greek sacrifice to a Cardiff shopping centre, which I always thought was just devastatingly brilliant. And Ghosts is terrific again, and it's great cast, but most importantly, a great adaptation in the sense that it makes people shocked. I mean, there's lots with Ghosts that you can't do anymore because certain aspects of it, if you're making it contemporary, don't work. So one of the key aspects is about hereditary syphilis, and you can't do that because obviously they'd have just given the son antibiotics and he'd have been all right. So you have to really work to make it truly shocking. And they have made it truly shocking. And I thought it was really interesting to see it and to have a sense of being pinned to the wall by it. And it becomes a story about the ongoing effects of abuse, which I was really impressed with.
Well, I think that's a good point at which to introduce this episode of the What's on Stage podcast with me, Alex Wood.
And me, Sarah Crompton.
And as mentioned, we have got a variety of very interesting questions, and we're going to be running through some of our favourites and digging out some rather interesting stories about some of our favourite theatre stars.
Yes.
And also lifting the lid on some of theatre's industry practices and sort of getting to the bottom of how the West End and other shows operate, which is a big old amount to try and cram into one episode, But we're going to try our best.
Well, the first question, I think, which you're going to read, because I haven't got it in front of me, but I think it could be the start for an ongoing series because it has, even on a sort of deep dive of research, produced so much. That we could, I think this will be part one of a multiple series. But ask the question, Alex.
Yeah, so George_B_22 asks, is it hard to work/perform with another castmate if you don't get along off stage? And that really led us to the topic of theatre feuds, where creatives or cast members famously don't get along, and whilst everything might seem jolly and sunshine-laden on stage, backstage there might be calamity and drama, which has subsequently been made public. So we have so many stories on this subject. Which one do you want to kick off with, Sarah? Because I think we could be here for ages.
We could be here for ages. I think what I'd like to do is start with the idea that at some levels it's quite hard to talk about this because sometimes you hear gossip that people are not getting on very well and you have absolutely no way of proving it to be true or not. And I think theatres and stages and plays are very, very much like your average workplace, where most of the time, if there is a feud or somebody isn't getting on with somebody else, they will do their best to disguise it and just get on with the job. And so the atmosphere backstage, you can cut with a knife. I've known a number of productions with a number of friends where there has been a massive falling out with the director. And I think a lot of tension does arise with, well, at least these are reasonably recent, but at least in the past, I think there can be a lot of problems with directors. But I'm not absolutely sure that you would have known it sitting in the theatre. So everybody just got their heads down, but were really unhappy. I mean, I have one friend who was so unhappy, and I had another set of friends who told me that they were in the same production together, and basically once that he was they were a director from abroad, and once they had left, left, the cast basically redirected the play. So it became quite a different production and a very happy one towards the end, which was interesting. And sometimes you can see it as well. There was a production where I said to you, I don't understand what's gone on here. And you said to me, oh, that's interesting because there's been a lot of rumours that people aren't getting on. And that was really interesting to me because you couldn't see that there was an argument, everybody was on stage doing their thing, but there was something off that you were watching. I thought that was interesting.
It's often the starriest productions where you hear about the horror stories because people who, say, for example, might have some big awards to their names can get away with saying some slightly less than pleasant things about their experience on the show. Whereas if you're a jobbing performer, you're not going to go around and slag off a producer or a director you might have just worked with because there's every chance you're going to have to work with them again if you want to stay employed on the next gig. But you're totally right in that often it is cast versus director because at least on some productions, there is that sort of director as dictator mentality at times. And, I think that thankfully is coming under a lot of scrutiny and there's a lot more democratic process in a lot of rehearsal rooms. But a lot of people can have very specific opinions about a creative process. And if those opinions rub up against others, tension can ensue. As, like you say, that happens in every workplace anyway. But I think in theatre, especially when you've got the pressure of previews and live audiences and tech rehearsals and it being so all-consuming, that compared to maybe some other jobs where you can switch off at the end of the day and then go and have a glass of Aperol Spritz and forget about everything, in theatre, you're living and breathing this tension. And sometimes it can be quite explosive, as we've found. Have you plunged into the annals of history?
I have plunged. I mean, the person you absolutely didn't want to fall out with is Laurence Olivier, who is a multiple feuder. And what's really interesting about Olivier is that he's clearly at some levels a monster, but people clearly at other levels adore him. So they keep on going back to work with him. The most notable example being John Gielgud, who he sort of summarily sacks from a production of Twelfth Night in Stratford, which is starring Vivien Leigh, who was then married to Olivier, who will come on to later as Viola, and Olivier as Malvolio, and Gielgud is notionally directing. And at one point, Olivier just says, what does he say? Johnny, dear boy, why don't you take a walk by the river? And he's never seen in the rehearsal room again. Yeah. And
darling John, go for a long walk by the river and leave us to get on with it. Yeah, that was it.
Poor Gielgud seems to have just swallowed this and, got on with the rest of his life and continued to work with Olivier. But what a thing. I mean, that is extraordinary. And then it comes that I think the bigger story with Olivier, and partly because it ties in so neatly with what we were talking about to Anushka Lucas last week, is UNESCO's Rhinoceros, the first production in Britain. And it's directed by Orson Welles. And this is a huge thing because it's 1960 and it covers London. And again, the love triangle is at its heart because this is the point where Olivier has acted with Joan Plowright in The Entertainer, fallen in love with her, and his relationship with Lee is collapsing. And I suspect that why he wanted to do Rhinoceros was that he would again be acting opposite Joan Plowright. But there's quite a long correspondence between him and Orson Welles about Orson Welles, who is really, never really makes anything quite work after Citizen Kane, but has all these interesting things. He's coming off the back of a disappointing production of Chimes at Midnight on Broadway. He wants to make his name in the theatre, and they land on Rhinoceros, which seems an odd choice for both of them. And Wells does his thing, he lights it, he designs the costumes, and he directs it. And for reasons that are mysterious, in a sense, having started with the high hopes on both sides and saying how they admired one another's work and they would only do it with each other, they fall out at some point during the process. And Olivier just brutally does the same thing again, does the same thing he did to Gielgud, and asks Wells to leave the rehearsal room. And though he comes back to the production and is still sort of setting the lights on the first night from the dress circle, apologising to the audience because they haven't quite finished, he never again gets back in the rehearsal room. And his account of it is that Olivier was perfect when he asked him to do things. So he would say, yes, Orson, and then follow the direction. But ran as a guerrilla campaign by taking groups of the cast into smaller rehearsals all the time and making it impossible for Wells to direct the ensemble. And he wrote later in his autobiography, Wells said that Olivier had to destroy me in some way. He doesn't want anyone else up there. And I think if you look at Olivier's career, that is probably true.
Famously immortalised in the play Orson's Shadow, I think they took that 1960 production Austin Pendleton did and turned it into a battle of rivaling egos.
Yeah, the joke playwright was very funny about the play because she said it bore no resemblance to historical truth, I think she said. Which Austin Pendleton, bless him, said, yeah, that's true, I've just written a play. But so...
Yeah, and it's, if you look through the National Theatre's wonderful Dramatic Exchanges book, the first sort of like third of it is essentially Olivier bad-mouthing every single person under the sun that doesn't do exactly what he wants them to, whilst going through the sort of like pressure cooker of trying to set up the National Theatre. I think he basically just slags off Kenneth Tynan, who was the literary manager, any given opportunity for any minor transgression. And I think he also said some less than pleasant things about Ian McKellen, sort of like saying he was pretty much destined to be a jobbing actor without anything dazzling to his name when McKellen refused to join sort of like the National Theatre Company for a 3-year spell. So yeah, it's funny, like you say, that we remember this guy through very rose-tinted glasses to some extent, but he wasn't exactly a very pleasant man. And I'm sure that, the further that you dig under the surface on Laurence Olivier, the more unpleasant it gets. It also just reminds me quite a lot of The Motive and the Cue, which brings on to Richard Burton, who famously had the ability to be quite unpleasant to his co-stars. That was sort of captured quite wonderfully in Jack Thorne's play when that was on at the National Theatre and in the West End.
Yeah, and those big figures. I think we'll do a whole episode on Olivier because I was digging around in this, I've read 2 biographies, or Skip read 2 biographies this morning. He fell out with Peter Brook as well and carries on working with him, So it's like almost a condition of working with Olivier that at some point you will fall out with him and you'll carry on. More worrying, of course, is, when the questioner asks about working with somebody you didn't like, the stories with Vivien Leigh are pretty awful because they carried on acting together on stage while their marriage was unravelling and while Leigh was falling into bipolar depression and really having complete mental breakdown. And there's a terrible story about her they were touring in New Zealand and she refused to go on because she hadn't got the right shoes. And they're in the wings, they're actually in the wings fighting, and he slaps her and she slaps him back. And then they walk on stage, her without shoes, and just do the scene. Noise is off, and many backstage dramas make much of couples falling out during a production, of which the most famous was Maggie Smith and Robert Stevens falling out while they were doing Noel Coward's Private Lives. So on stage, it was one of the great productions of a battling couple and a marriage falling apart, and backstage life was imitating art. And I had a friend who told me that he was walking down the street one day and it was somewhere on Shaftesbury Avenue, I can't remember where it was, and he heard a window open and a loud cry of anger followed by some kind of object coming out of the window, and he looked up to discover that it was Maggie Smith hurling something at Robert Stevens in the street below. So that, obviously calm did not reign backstage.
Yeah. Oh gosh, yeah. And then, like you say, they almost channel all that energy into committed and incredible performances, behind the scenes. chaos. A few that I spotted whilst doing some research on this one. I mean, half the cast of Glee, for example, I mean, they pretty much had a huge falling out, and that's kind of theatre related to some extent. One of the big ones from Broadway, and I feel like these Americans have kind of taken over the mantle in terms of big feuds. Whereas we may have got over it towards the end of the 20th century, they're carrying on. So there was the 2016 revival of She Loves Me on Broadway with Laura Benanti and Zachary Levi. And then I think Zachary Levi has since had a bit of a fall from grace because he said some pretty awful things about vaccines that I won't repeat here. They were co-starring in this production, and it seemed to go pretty well at the time, but then she did an interview 8 years later and said that Zachary Levi was sucking up all the effing energy in the room. He wanted to mansplain everyone's part to them, and said that the whole thing felt like he was bringing a dance party energy to rehearsals. That's quite a funny one, but also interesting that it then took 8 years for sort of like the bad blood to emerge, whereas I think with some of the productions, that especially Olivier ones, the explosiveness was known pretty quickly. But it's almost like these stars keep things under the bonnet, and then if they feel like there's an opportunity to say something and sort of like clear the record so they can distance themselves from someone they might not like, then they'll use the ammunition where they can.
Yeah, and there's also always the question of whether if you get a reputation for being difficult, why you're getting a reputation for being difficult, and how much that is sucking up the energy in the room, and how much it is trying to give the perfect performance. And I was interested, Trevor Eve recently did an interview with Radio Times in which he said that he felt that his reputation for being difficult had caused him to get less work. When he was doing the John Osborne play, Unmissable Evidence, at the National, that was a show in which there were rumours of a troubled rehearsal room. But then if you got Osborne there, that would probably, again, might have been a source of that, because Osborne, of course, was a terrible feuder. So he fell out with all his wives and was vicious about all of them. So I can imagine that any rehearsal room that contained Trevor Eve trying to do his best and being a perfectionist, I guess, and John Osborne, being John Osborne, might have been a source of some unhappiness. And, you know, Osborne, the vitriol with which he attacked people was extraordinary. So,
yes. Another playwright example that I found was in Nick Heitner's Balancing Acts book, where he went for dinner with Bob Crowley and they ran into Harold Pinter. Oh, yes. And Heitner had been on the fence about programming double bill from Pinter for, I think it was Celebration in the Room. Pinter very much took umbrage in the most explosive way possible and came over to Heitner and shouted and called him an effing liar and an effing word that rhymes with squit, for sort of like backing out on this programming choice. Heitner felt very bruised by the encounter, and then I think he said 2 years later they were working on another show and Pinter was just like absolutely saint-like to him and didn't say a single word and almost like had completely forgotten that the encounter ever happened. So it's very interesting that Pinter's someone that clearly when he gets going he can really lash out, but then seemingly forgets about it. I think Douglas Hodge called him a violent pacifist, which sounds about right, really, from what happened. I guess, you know, if you're as successful as Harold Pinter, you can sort of get away with shouting at the artistic director of the National Theatre in that way.
I guess it's part of well, as you say, I think it's a slightly old-fashioned view of the creative arc. I mean, I've been talking to James Graham this week, who has been talking about the energy in the room for Dear England and about how he very much went in and said, look, I don't know everything about football and you will know much more. So kind of humility, which I think the old school playwrights like Pinter and Osborne very much stood by the idea of them being angry men and staying angry men. I think the dynamic in rehearsal rooms has changed, probably for the better, and there are probably slightly fewer feuds now as a result, though there are long-standing ones which are quite funny. Yes. And the one between Patti LuPone and Andrew Lloyd Webber is one of the very, very best, I think.
Yeah. Stemming back to kind of like half a century worth of feuding to some extent, but really it's the crunch point came with the production of Sunset Boulevard, I suppose. Yeah,
it's a real love-hate relationship in a way. Well, certainly on Lloyd Webber's part, it seems to be. So he obviously he likes LuPone and can see that she's an amazing dramatic actress. But yes, so she does Sunset Boulevard in London, memorably and brilliantly. But then, as it goes to Broadway, he asks her to stand down and brings in Glenn Close to take on.
Yes, because Glenn Close had done it during the West Coast preview run before Broadway, and he'd almost decided which of the two that he preferred.
And Lepone gets I think Lepone in many ways gets the last laugh with this story generally, because she sued, didn't she? And she was given £1 million. And she used the £1 million to build a swimming pool, which she christened the Andrew Lloyd Webber Memorial Pool, and said that every time it was sunny and she and all her friends were sitting by the pool, she felt that it was the best thing that had ever happened to her.
Yeah, it must have been quite a less than pleasant experience to feel passed over for a role that you're probably very invested in, and one that you had put so much of your own time into, but also succeeded in doing in London. And then it's sort of like, I'm sure that you don't want to be pitted against Glenn Close or anything, but then I guess you can kind of dip into contract law and then win the day to some extent. But yeah, that feud continued for decades, really, and then still, there's many more twists and turns to the story between Andrew Lloyd Webber and Patti LuPone, even when all seemed well.
Yeah, there's a brilliant coda, isn't there? Because she calls a truce. I mean, she publicly calls a truce when she goes up and kisses him, having sung Don't Cry for Me, Argentina at a gala.
Yes, I think she also gave tribute to him at the Grammys. She's performed in 2018.
That's it, yeah.
Which is sort of like, put it all to bed, say, look, I still recognise you are an incredible sort of like composer and I'm a big fan of yours. It felt like all was well at that point. However, that was right at the start of 2018. And then a month later, Andrew Lloyd Webber's autobiography Unmasked comes out, where he has some less than pleasant words to say about her performance in Evita, which she starred in, about her diction. And it was altogether probably sort of like reignited some of the bad blood that might have been otherwise sort of like put away. To some extent, it felt like there probably the enmity was back. Although she did recently go and see Sunset Boulevard on Broadway with Nicole Scherzinger. So maybe finally their feud has come to an end. Yeah, someone needs to write a musical about the Patti LuPone Andrew Lloyd Webber feud.
Well, somebody has written a musical about him at least, but
yeah, true. That's very true. Yeah, just ask them to Flo and Joan to keep trying, do a part 2. I can't believe we've dedicated so much time to one question.
Rich theme. Let's do the next question.
New record. Okay, so Performing X Alicia asks, do West End shows play theatre warm-up games backstage?
Well, I know about this a little bit, at any rate. Yes, is the short answer. But they're not exactly games. There are some wonderful books of photographs. My knowledge in this is entirely from this, and actually from having been in theatres where people have been about to go on stage. So that's my two sources. There's a brilliant bunch of photographs called The Half, which is about actors at the half hour bell just before they go on stage, where on the whole they tend to be a fairly meditative state and on their own. But before that, they will have done some warming up. So I have been in theatres where the cast are all called onto the stage at about 6:15, 6:30, and they will do warm-up exercises, they will do yoga, they will do stretching, they will do vocal exercises, they will maybe play some small trust games, depending on how elaborate. As far as I know, those comings together are voluntary, but I think most people do them, and certainly in productions where the cast are all getting on, it is regarded as a bonding exercise. The very good photographer David Laveau did a series of photographs early this year of backstage in theatre, and he recorded some of these rituals, including the one for Giant, where they do go on stage and they do yoga and stretching, and often just chat. I think there's a certain amount of gossiping. It's creating a bond, and especially with a play like Giant, where you're dealing with very troubling subject matter. I think very often the intention is to create a good feeling, so that you've got a separation between what's happening on the stage when you're acting and what's happening off the stage when you are a group of people who get on and are broadly really nice. Lithgow has expanded this process by introducing Elliot Levy and Richard Hope to the wonderful game of Botticelli, which is a quiz where you get the right to ask a direct question about, it's like 20 questions with a twist. So you get the right to ask a direct question by asking an indirect question about this person with the same initial. It's a brilliant game. If people want me to show you how to play it on a subsequent podcast, I will introduce Alex to the nature of it, because it's a fabulous game. And so they sit and do this together before the show as well. And I think that is all bonding. In that same series of photographs, Papa Essiedu said that when he was doing the monologue Death of England, he arrives at theatres 3 hours in advance, which is amazing, to give himself time to get into the space of the production and do some yoga, do some breathing, do some stretching, and just give himself time to become the figure he's about to play. And there's a lot of voice work that goes on either communally or separately in dressing rooms. So I think the simple answer is yes, most companies do have some form of formalised warm-up, and they will devise exactly what it is according to the nature of the play, the nature of the people involved in it.
I think there's also every January a large number of West End shows will all do their own version of the Traitors backstage.
Really?
They'll do that. I think actually quite a few offices did this as well, where they'd have, traitors within their midst, and they'd have the faithful, and then they'd vote people out. And I think also Mean Girls has some incredibly creative warm-up games at the Savoy at the moment, because they rig up the projectors for the screens behind the show, and then they'll also put on some like bespoke assets and sort of snazz it up, which is really lovely. So yeah, I think a lot of shows like to form that sense of community through their games. Also, a lot of the time there's naturally a lot, like you say, a lot of yoga, putting on, big pumping playlists and really working up a sweat on stage before a show begins. And I believe at the Lyceum Theatre for the West End production of The Lion King, Shauna Scoffrey and George Asprey, who have both been in the show for 15 years together, have become black belts in jiu-jitsu, which they practice on stage between shows on double show days. So that is amazing in terms of the bond that they formed. So yeah, I think that's the most extreme version, but that's a pretty brilliant warm-up game.
Yeah, they are pretty brilliant, and it is exactly that thing of being a family and creating an atmosphere that contrary to the first question, stops you falling out with the people that you're working with. Because if you're in a long run, like George Asprey has been in that run forever, I know him, and you need to bond with the company. You need to engage yourself, and these are all ways of doing it. Next question, Alex.
Yes, next question. So Fulton Cameron asks, when is Paddington the Musical opening? Which has been on lots of people's minds for, I think it was announced in late 2023 that Paddington was coming to the stage. And
can you reveal that?
Yeah. Well, yesterday it was officially confirmed that it will be opening at the Savoy Theatre later this year. I think more details coming next month about tickets and everything. It's got direction by Luke Shepherd, who we're a big fan of, who directed Anne Juliet and Starlight Express, which is currently running at the Troubadour Wembley Park Theatre. And it has a book by Jessica Swale, who's brilliant writer, and music and lyrics by Tom Fletcher, as in founding member of McFly, Tom Fletcher, who I spoke to about the project, I think, in last December, so 2024. And he said that the first time he sees Paddington on stage, he burst out crying. And that's something that I've heard from actually quite a few people, saying that seeing Paddington in the flesh has had a profound emotional effect on them. Although I'm not exactly sure how they're going to bring Paddington to the stage yet. That might be confirmed soon.
Yeah, they haven't revealed that, have they? Of how they're actually going to do the bear.
Because you'd think it would be puppetry, but I just don't know. I'm just not 100% sold on that. There might be something else there. So, a musical highlight for many, many years to come. I can't imagine it going anywhere because I can envisage that will be a bit of a blockbuster experience.
Yes, and thank you for that beautifully timed question, because it's very nice to be able to reveal something.
Thank you, Fulton Cameron. Yeah, it's almost like you knew it was coming, which I don't think you did. Maybe you did. Maybe you'd heard some rumblings on the internet. And then Maddie in a Hat asks, what is the process in deciding which swing goes on last minute for a track, which is the very complicated and often unexplainable melange of criteria and processes around understudies, alternates, swings, all that stuff, which to everyday theatre goers can often be hard to untangle. But we're going to try our best, and we've actually roped in a few people to help. But Sarah, have you ever seen any big understudies or alternates that you've been a big fan of, or swings?
No, and well, I have. I mean, I'm sure I have. But the brilliant thing about alternates and swings is that you don't notice them in a funny way. So the greatest, it's an awful thing to say, but the greatest alternate performance is the one that just completely blends into the ensemble. What you don't want is the Bridget Jones style alternate who's left on stage where everybody else walks off or whatever. You want them just to be totally part of it. And I have known many people who work as swings specifically, and I've spent many hours asking them to describe exactly what they do. Yeah. And I don't really know, except that I do know that by and large, they know every single dance routine in every single configuration in a show, in a musical, the ones I know. And that just seems to me astonishing that they can hold that in their head and go on with no sense of terror. Just do the job. So I'm rather hoping that you will now tell me, and I will finally understand what it is that they do.
I feel like I'm going to make this even more complicated than it was before, in fact. So you have to start by saying that not every show is the same, and just how every company outside of the theatre world has a different configuration, and the way that employment works can change. West End shows and touring shows can be quite different in the way that they work with swings and alternates and covers. So with touring production, they will often have holidays built into the touring schedule. So you'll see, if you look through tour dates for big musicals, that there'll be 1 or 2 weeks where there's no shows. So those are sort of like dedicated holiday time. Whereas for West End shows, often when you sign or you build the contract for the show, you have to sort of ask for the leave in advance. So you say, look, I want to take these days off because it's my birthday, or it's my wedding, or it's stuff like that, where you kind of have to build your annual leave into your annual contract. Obviously, if you're not going to be there for the show, someone needs to be there for the show. And this is where alternates, understudies and swings, etc. all come into their own. I'll start with alternates because that's probably the easiest to understand. So you'll see, for example, on big musicals like Sunset Boulevard with Nicole Scherzinger, that they'll have alternates that will have dedicated dates. That will mean that, if for Nicole Scherzinger, she says, okay, I'm not going to be working any Mondays, Rachel Tucker will have all those Mondays, and those will be her set dates. And she knows that she's going on those specific dates, and that's agreed in advance, and that's not something that then is arranged ad hoc or based on, say, for example, if Nicole Scherzinger is feeling under the weather. Then you get understudies who, while sometimes might have dates, more often than not, they're there just in case there's an issue. So you'll have I think it was Lara Denning for the West End production of Sunset Boulevard, who was almost primed and ready in case Nicole couldn't go on. And they're there just kind of like as a safety net, just in case there's any issues. Then you get to the more complicated and the messy idea of swings. So I actually went to Dean Johnson, who is a director in the West End. He's done shows like Once in Concert and Starry, which is a new musical that he was workshopping, and Bat Boy, I think that was also at the Palladium. And he was talking about So I'll read out what he says basically. So if a performer has a time off or a holiday, then the covering schedule is generally organised by a mixture of the general management on behalf of the producers, or the resident director and the company manager, who will then track and distribute the rota system. The covers and the swings are generally rehearsed in by the resident director and the choreographer after a press night, based on agreed time off. And then that generally means that those swings and covers will know which dates they're going to be going on when the original cast member isn't going to be present. Swings are often given a chance to cover as much as possible during a cover run, so that they can sort of like get to grips with all the different possible tracks that they're going to be covering during a show. So that's what, in an ideal world, if no one is ever ill, that's what covers and swings are there for. It's to cover that time where performers have got time booked off. However, it gets messier once there's illnesses or unexpected absences. That's where, say, let's just imagine a company member from Back to the Future has come down with a horrible norovirus, and it's just not worth them coming in because they're just going to infect the whole company and make it 20 times worse. So at this point, in an ideal world, the company manager would be notified. And because it's a last minute affair, they essentially have to work with whoever's in the building and say, look, we need to try and cover this show with a performer absent. So it's between the general manager, the resident director, the dance captain and the company manager will all work together to see, who can work out who's available. Do they fit the track of the person missing? Do they have the ability to do it? But then there's also the possibility, and a lot of shows might have this, that if they are missing certain covers or ensemble members, they'll have to do a cut version of the show where they'll alter the choreography, or they'll alter the scene slightly to allow it to go ahead with the number of performers they have. So what that means is that swings and covers aren't just having to learn multiple versions of one version of the show. They'll have to learn multiple tracks on multiple versions of the show, depending on how many potential cast members there are. So at this point, it gets even more impressive because they're not just learning one show, they're learning 3 or 4 different variations of a show, which is incredible.
It's absolutely amazing. And I can't name them in case it's wrong to say this, but also the other thing that happens is that West End production companies may call on a swing who is in one, or a dance captain who is in one show, and ask them to learn a track in another show that is coming out of the same production company in dire emergencies. So one of the people I knew was in Book of Mormon and was the swing on that show, and had 3 performance days where they were performing in Book of Mormon, and then they were getting in a cab and running across town to cover on Dreamgirls, which had an absolute disaster with people being ill. And it was only a tiny role in Dreamgirls. It was, absolutely minimal sort of set of steps and coming on stage, and I think there was but I mean, nevertheless, they were going between the 2 shows, and you just think, oh my god, that is so astonishing, and my respect for them all is so great. And I love the fact that now in programs they always try to identify who is going on, and quite often on Twitter and Instagram you will be notified of what covers, alternate swings are doing on any particular day. And that seems to me to be giving them the credit that they so much deserve, because they're absolutely essential to the running of a theatre. And without them, the show literally would not go on. Yeah,
if you look through, I think, at West End Covers on Twitter/X, you'll see dozens of these notifications every single day saying, so-and-so is playing this role as like the first cover, or so-and-so is making their debut in the role of, all this stuff, which is really, really exciting because it's, like you say, celebrating these performers. And actually there's a very loyal fan base in the West End that will want to go and see these covers for their initial performances. So, there'll be a special occasion for them when there's an ensemble member who is going on as the lead. I think That happened recently in The Curious Case of Benjamin Button, just after the Olivier's. One of the cover Benjamins went on, and everyone was raving about his performance.
Nice.
I guess if we started this podcast by talking about some of the feuds in the West End, we've ended with some of the most lovely things in the West End about people all pitching in and supporting each other. One fine
and regional. Regional theatres too. Actually, West End and regional and tours and so on. Because I think so. That's the other thing that happens. Just to conclude that thought, that people who've done the show in London, if there's a disaster, or vice versa, so or done the show on tour, if there's a disaster, they will be called in, and they will. They can quite often pick up a few performances where somebody's ill, or all the tracks don't quite work on those very complicated Excel sheets.
It's like Six the Musical. Obviously, there are 6 roles, which means that I think they have super swings who are known for being able to go on for any queen at any performance. So that's why they're super swings, because they're a step above. Normally they'd have someone who would cover or alternate individual queens, but this is something extra special if you're a super swing. And sometimes they can be catapulted across the UK, either to be in the touring production or in the West End, depending on where they might be. So actually, like you say, the West End and the regional productions can often really help each other out. And then there was also the case of Aisha Juando, who had just finished in Tina, the Tina Turner musical, and then went to play Angelica Schuyler in Hamilton. And as anyone would know, Angelica's probably one of the most difficult roles in contemporary musical theatre. But Tina was in a bit of a bind because it was Tina Turner's birthday and they had no one to lead the West End show. And you can't cancel Tina on Tina Turner's birthday, so they had to get Aisha Juando back from the touring production of Hamilton, which was in Manchester, and she just hopped straight down to London to play Tina Turner, which again, incredibly difficult role, and then had to go back and carry on performing in Hamilton for the rest of the tour, which is, amazing performance. And I think it's brilliant that you have that flexibility. So quite a positive note to end. I'm quite
really positive note to end on. Very happy to end with that
podcast. Yes.
So I think that's perfect set of questions, dear listeners. Thank you.
And please, if you've got any other questions, please do send them to feedback@WhatsOnStage.com. We will always be here willing to answer them on our regular Q&A episodes. And we love hearing from everyone who listens and has their own opinions and thoughts and ideas about what they want to hear about. So that's lovely. And I think, speaking of things that people hear about, next episode will be a National Theatre special for Indu Rubasingham's first season at the National, so that could be very exciting.
So we're looking forward to that. Yes,
she will soon have to make sure you tune in.
She will soon be in one of the many books about the National Theatre. Which will be telling you of everything that's happening backstage. But for now, we will just get we're fascinated to know her new season. That will be something. So, shall we say goodbye? Do you think?
Yes.
This is the moment to say goodbye from me, Sarah Crompton.
And a goodbye from me, Alex Wood. Make sure you like, follow, subscribe, rate, leave a comment, and generally just shout about the podcast wherever you can. We'll be back with full episodes every Friday and a smattering of bonus episodes in between if we find something interesting to tell you about. But in the meantime, have a lovely weekend.